Welcome to the Traveling Image Makers Podcast, your source of inspiration about travel photography. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride as we bring you on a tour around the world with our guests.
Hi, this is Ugo Cei, and this is the Traveling Image Makers Podcast, the show where we interview famous and not-so-famous photographers and discover what compels them to travel many hours and cross many borders to get the shots. A few weeks ago, in episode 185, I had a conversation on this very podcast with Valérie Jardin. Most of the discussion we had was centered on an article that was published on the New York Daily News entitled "When Your Photograph Harms Me, New York Should Look to Curb Unconsensual Photography of Women." It would have been easy to discount the article as yet another rant about street photography and its purported invasion of privacy. But the fact that it was written by an Asian woman got me thinking. It made me think that photography is mostly a white guy's club. Women are a minority, and people of color, especially black, are even a smaller minority. Black women photographers? Personally, I don't know any. We white guys tend to overlook this fact, and it's easy for us to become race blind and gender blind. When I look at the issue of photographing strangers in the street, it's easy for me to think that I should apply a sort of a golden rule. I am not going to treat others in ways that I wouldn't want to be treated myself. But is that really enough? The problem with that attitude is that I try to imagine how I would feel if I were in front of the camera. But I'm a white guy, not a woman of color, for example. Maybe I should try to imagine what it feels like to be in front of the camera as a woman of color. It might not exactly be the same. So I thought of inviting to the show my longtime friend Ibarionex Perello, who is not only a great street photographer, but is also a black photographer, and ask him how he feels about this issue and how he sees things from his own unique perspective. If you don't know Ibarionex, you can check out his website at ibarionex.net. He's not only a great photographer with over 25 years of experience in the photographic industry, but he's also an educator and also a podcast host. He's the host of the Candid Frame podcast, one of the longest running podcasts with many hundred episodes under his belt. So please join me in welcoming Ibarionex Perello to the show. Welcome to the show, Ibarionex. A long time no see.
Yeah, thank you, man. It's good to have a chance to talk to you. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. You were a guest on this show years ago. I remember I was also a guest on your show even longer ago. So it's good to catch up again. What's new in your world? What's been happening this past few years or recently? You got any?
Well, more recently, things are opening up now, which is really nice. We had our first meal with another couple, I think about 2 weeks ago. And we went to an outdoor little cafe near the beach. And it was so nice to have a meal with other people. You know, I love my family, but it was just nice to see other faces. And, besides that, I got out the last couple of weeks. I've been actually getting out and doing more street photography because I really haven't done it for most of the year. And in a couple of weeks, me and my wife are going to be headed out to Paris for an overdue vacation.
So that's going to be a vacation, no work.
Yeah. I'm always shooting while I'm there, but it'll be nice to get away from the routine here. So just like everyone else, we're just getting back to something that resembles normal.
How's the podcast going?
Good. This is its 15th year.
Wow.
And it's been going really, really well. I'm really excited about many of the people that I've had to interview this season. I did change one thing a couple of weeks ago. I went back to bi-weekly. I've been doing the show weekly for years now. But there were other projects that I needed to work on, and I just couldn't I didn't have the bandwidth to be able to do all the work that I needed to do for a weekly show. in terms of all the research and doing the interviews and on top of everything else I'm trying to do. So, on a suggestion of a friend of mine, decided to go every other week, and that's been a great help. And it doesn't seem that people really mind very much because it allows them more of an opportunity to catch up on episodes, because I know that people don't get to listen to every single episode as it comes out, and the numbers kind of reflect that. So I think that people are just happy to have a good conversation and have it be pretty consistent in terms of it coming out.
Yeah, I have to say that my consumption of podcasts has decreased quite a bit during this period because of the pandemic. It's one thing that strangely has been impacted, because I used to listen to podcasts when I was traveling on a plane or driving around long drives and so on. I would listen to the podcast in the car or on the train. And having gone pretty much nowhere, I have a long queue of podcasts episodes, including yours, to listen to. So I don't know when I will be able to catch up, but hopefully soon.
Well, they'll be there waiting for you.
Yeah, I'll still be there. I think I got my podcast app here as something like 186 episodes still to listen to. Queued up. Still downloaded. Anyway, and you've been writing books, right? Still during those years, I know. Just to
Since the last time we talked, probably the last book that I wrote was Making Photographs, developing a personal visual workflow, and that came out maybe about 2 years ago, and but that's been the last book that I've done. There are a couple of other book ideas I'm bandying about, but nothing that I'm completely immersed in right now. They're just ideas now. And then I'm working on some other projects that I can't really talk about right now, all of which are keeping me busy. And then I work at the Huntington Museum Library and Gardens as a special projects photographer. So I do have a 9 to 5, and there I'm photographing a lot of archival materials, like old letters, stuff that's 200, 300 years old, books, artwork. And then on top of that, I'm doing the podcast and writing magazine articles and whatever else that, needs to get done during the course of the week. So there's never a shortage of things to do.
Of course. Anyway, the reason I asked you to come on this show is, as I mentioned in the introduction, I had this conversation a few weeks ago with our common friend Valérie Jourdain about this article that I saw online. I was alerted to the article by another friend, Levi Sim, and the article was about this, written by this woman who was complaining about being photographed in the street without her permission. And during my conversation with Valerie, what I started thinking of was that when I think of this situation, right, when I think of, is it okay for me to take photos of people in the street without asking their permission, that I try to always apply a sort of a golden rule, where I say, what would I think if I were the person in front of the camera? Would it be okay for me to be photographed in that situation? And I use that to drive my decisions in that respect. But then I started thinking that, well, not everybody is equal. Not everybody is the same. I'm privileged to be a white guy. And like it or not, this is a category that is privileged in most places of the world, including where I live, if not the least for the fact that here we are the majority. It's kind of normal to be a person like me. So I thought that maybe a person who is not a straight white guy would think of things differently. And I thought maybe I need to put myself in their shoes, not think just of myself in front of the camera, but think of what it would feel to be a woman of color, maybe in front of the camera in that situation. And I thought that maybe I would think and see things differently. But it's really difficult for me to imagine how one would feel in that situation, right? It's not my usual situation. Now, of course, when conversing with Valerie, we talked about it from the perspective of a woman, which is, of course, much different from that of a man. But I also thought that also being a person of color or not white would be different. I thought, I don't know many photographers of color. I don't know probably I don't know even one single personally. I mean, if I were to look into, think about the artists that I know indirectly, of course some can come to mind, but I personally don't know of any woman of color who is a photographer, because this is also very much a business that is very much the majority of photographers, professional ones, tend to be male and tend to be white for whatever reason. So I would really like to have your opinion about this. How does it feel from your point of view? What are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about for a very, very long time. And I'll start off with a story. When I was in Dominican Republic, I think it was like 1990. And I went to visit my father, who was there on vacation. He was born in a small town called Monte Cristi. And I went down there while I was in college at UC Berkeley. And this was the first time where I had spent time with my father as an adult. Because my parents had gotten divorced several years before. He was remarried. He had a young daughter, my sister. And so I went there and, of course, took my camera to make images. And we were driving down the road one day, and Dominican Republic is on the island of Hispaniola. It shares that island with Haiti. And one day we were driving down the road and we stopped somewhere, and there are people along the roads who may sell things like fruit, nuts, little vendors. And some of these people are selling things just outside of their home, which may be like a really modest sort of, I don't want to call it a shack, but it's probably like a one-room house, right? And I remember seeing people that were obvious to me that they were tourists who had stopped there as well. And I saw them enter the house and make photographs. And that immediately struck me as something that was just very wrong. Because I couldn't imagine that if the people who were vendors there were walking down the street of these people, these tourists, and the door was open, that they would take that kind of liberty to walk into the home and start making photographs. And it really made the impression in me in terms of the entitlement that people have when they possess a camera and they visit a community of a different culture, of a different race. And that was something I always wanted to be sensitive about as a photographer, because even though I'm a person of color, because I possess a camera, I have a certain amount of entitlement. The cameras are not cheap, so I understand that I'm of a different class. Yes, I'm of a different race, but there are a lot of assumptions that people with cameras make about who and when and how they photograph people. So that's something that really has sort of been at the forefront of my mind, and something that I'm very sensitive about when I'm photographing, because I've seen plenty of times where people will photograph others, particularly if they're people of color, or if they're in circumstances that are outside of the photographer's sort of cultural norm, whether it's because they're traveling or they're just visiting a different community. And I think that there's a belief that because they have a legal right to photograph, because they're on a public street, so on and so forth, that it's their right to make a photograph of anyone and anything. But I always think that it's important for the photographer to ask themselves, you know, to question themselves in terms of that entitlement, right? Why are you making this photograph? Why? What's your intention behind making that photograph? One of the things when people ask me about photographing homeless people, for example, you know, a lot of people feel for some people it's easy to make a picture of somebody that's homeless. And I asked them, would you be as quick to photograph someone who's wearing a 3-piece suit or wearing an attaché, carrying an attaché case, or someone who's in a position of authority where they could challenge you about you wielding the camera in their direction, and if there is sort of a hesitation, then you have to recognize the fact that, because this person is disempowered to a certain degree, you feel a greater liberty to make a photograph of that person. And that's not to say that you should never make a photograph. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you have to be conscious of the fact that those biases and those prejudices exist, and that they can inform, how and when you decide to make a photograph.
Absolutely. It made me think about the fact that sometimes I consider myself a travel photographer, at least in part, and thinking about the reason why when we travel, we want to photograph people from the places that we go to. And one reason, of course, we want to document the travels, right? Make those cultures, those places visible to others who might not have been able to visit them. But sometimes we take for granted the fact that we photograph people because they are alien to us to a certain extent. They are different, right? So you're a guy from India or a woman from India dressed with a sari. To me, it's unusual. It's different. It would not be to an Indian, probably. So I think that photograph has merit because it's different, because the person is different, belongs to a different cultural background. But is it really so? I mean, is that enough to justify taking a photo? Does it make the photo interesting? Maybe that's a different topic, but
yeah. I mean, I the fact that something seems exotic to us as a photographer is obviously something that's going to lead us to want to make a photograph of it. We're reacting to it. We find it interesting. So just like anyone else, I would want to make a photograph if I saw a woman in a beautiful sari in India and there's beautiful light hitting her. I think that my intentions are, I feel like my intentions are always good, and they're always sort of respectful, whether or not the subject is aware of me making a photograph or not. I see something in them that I think is beautiful, either because of just the way they're adorned or just because of their relationship in terms of the space. I don't feel like I have any sort of ulterior motive behind it. I kind of bristle when I see photographs, and I've seen them for years, of photographers who use telephoto lenses to take pictures of young girls. They go to the beach and they have their 7200, and they're making pictures of these scantily clad women surreptitiously, and those kind of images just feel creepy to me. They're rarely particularly good photographs, and when I see that that's exclusively what a photographer is creating in terms of their imagery, I really kind of question in terms of their sort of their intentions with it. Not that that they're going to do something disgusting with, with the photographs or inappropriate. But I just think that there's a relationship between them and the subject that is a little bit problematic. I will photograph, a woman that I that strikes me as an interesting subject matter, but I'm not working with telephoto lenses. I tend to work with a 50 or a 35 or a 28, and that not everyone is going to be aware of the fact that I'm making a photograph, but sometimes they are, and if they do make eye contact, I'll smile, a nod, or I may engage in conversation with them. It's been rare that someone has told me that they want to delete the photograph, and if they want me to delete the photograph, I'll try to explain what I'm doing, and and I'll show it to them, and I'll offer to, send it to them or tag them. But if they insist on me deleting the photograph, I'm fine with it. But that's rarely happened. But I always just sort of come back, or what are my intentions about it? And my intentions are never to disrespect, demean, or humiliate my subjects when I'm making a photograph. I'm trying to be respectful of them as a human being. And I think that when going back to the, initial part of the conversation in terms of photographing people of color, assuming that you're white and you come from a certain class, I don't want to deter people from making those images. I just want them to think about and be aware of that there are certain biases and certain assumptions that you may make even unconsciously that may be informing, how you make those photographs, and just to question some of them, and it may result in you taking on a different perspective that leads to you making better photographs by maybe actually engaging people more often when you do want to make their photograph, rather than being at a distance and trying to do it, incognito. I'm constantly sort of challenging myself in terms of my approach in photographing subject matter. So I do it all the time, even though my circumstances are different. I think every photographer should. But I think especially us as photographers, we constantly have to be aware of the privilege that we possess just by the fact that we own this expensive equipment, especially when you go to a country where all that equipment would be years worth of income for an entire family.
Yeah. You mentioned biases, and I think that was something that I was trying to convey my feelings in that respect. I started realizing that I have biases that are largely unconscious. I can be blind about race and gender, right? And when I think what it would feel like to be in front of the camera, I don't realize that my trying to imagine, to perceive what that would be, is colored by my biases. So I've started more thinking, as you said, right? Engaging people is probably, whenever I find myself in a situation where that could be an issue, engaging people and even just asking for simple permission is probably going to be something that I'm going to do more and more, even though that might mean losing a possible candid moment.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
right.
Absolutely, yeah. Because I know for some photographers that the photograph is all important, but the reality is the majority of photographs that we make are passable. They're good. They're not necessarily portfolio worthy. So, the loss of even a good image for the sake of being able to have sort of a genuine human encounter, however brief, for me is always much more valuable to me than sometimes the photograph is. And sometimes I'm just not able to produce a photograph that really meets the high level that I set out for myself in terms of making an exceptional photograph. More time than not, it's an opportunity for me to practice composing, using light, engaging a subject, or if I'm doing it as sort of in a candid way of being able to build a composition with all these various elements, the background, the foreground, the subject, and make for an interesting photograph. A lot of those things are just, for me, sort of exercises leading up to a moment where everything gels and I have perfect synchronicity and everything just gets pulled off, right? So the fact that I don't get each and every shot, I don't see as problematic, right? And
Right.
there are some times where the engagement with the people is much more important to me. There's a person that I photographed recently who's one of the last 3 newspaper vendors on Broadway in downtown Los Angeles. And I've been photographing in downtown Los Angeles for about 30 years, and there used to be an abundance of these people. Now there's only 3, and this guy's name's Manuel. And I was talking to him because I was very curious about how many were left, and and I talked to him, and I made a nice portrait of him, seated in his space, and it's up on my Instagram from a couple of weeks ago. And the photograph is a nice portrait, it's a sort of a sliver of time, because at some point, these people are not going to be there anymore because of all the gentrification that's happening. But for me, the encounter with him, learning a bit about his story, for me was just as important as the photograph that I made, because I had a real curiosity of him, not just as a photographic subject, but as a human being, as a person. And I wanted to learn something about the story, because these newspaper and magazine vendors were such a linchpin of that community for as long as I could remember as a kid, when I used to go down with my parents and go to the movie theaters and go shopping at the department stores. And to see them disappearing, I felt it was important for me to make the photograph, but also to learn something about him, so that he wasn't just an anonymous figure in a photo. So I think there are times where it's important for us to really think about, are we making the photograph so important that we are too easily dismissing or not even considering the humanity of the people that we're photographing? And I guess, it's a case-by-case basis, It's not like you have to do that for every bloody shot you make, But I think you have to sort of have a healthy balance between, being a decent human being and then being a photographer. I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
No, you made me think, or realize rather, that probably the photographs that I like, my own photographs that I like the most, that I'm more attached to personally, at least. Maybe they will never win any awards, but the photographs of people that I've taken while traveling, that I am attached to the most, are photos that have a story attached to them. Mm-hmm. And typically this is a story that resulted from an interaction between me and the subject I photographed. I remember one, for example, one that comes to mind is a family I photographed in Chefchaouen in Morocco. I don't know if you've ever been to Morocco, but if you know that people there generally do not like being photographed without their permission.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But if you ask, most of them will say yes, right? So we met this family in Chefchaouen, and I thought they were really interested, so I engaged them in conversation with my very basic French. I managed to master a few words of French because they were speaking French, not English, and we learned that they were coming from Meknes to visit their sons or daughters who had a family there, and visit the city, which is a tourist destination for Moroccans too. And I still have those photos among my favorites, and the fact that they were able to engage and have those people look into the camera with the father especially was a very interesting gentleman, very penetrating gaze, very, very strong. Or a group of workers in Oman, for example, was another such situation. So I remember the stories and I remember the conversations. And to me, those are more valuable than the photos themselves. And sometimes the photos are even probably more successful because it's probably easier and to get a better photo if you start to engage with somebody and you relax and they relax, rather than just snapping something quickly on the street. Of course, there's something to be said for the decisive moment, something that happens and you need to snap a photo because there's something happening in that specific moment that is a candid scene, which would not happen elsewhere. But again, my favorite ones are probably those that have a story behind them and interaction. I don't know if that's the same for you.
Yeah, it is very much the same for me. But as you just mentioned, going into a place where you don't speak the language puts a real big hamper on it. I speak Spanish, so if I go into a Spanish-speaking country, I'm able to sort of engage with people and create a situation where I'm much more intimate and close. I always love photographing people doing something. So if it's someone who's like shaving ice, or someone who's say a butcher or a bread maker, and I can talk to them a bit, engage with them, and then be able to get them to sort of return to what they're doing and get in there with a 16 millimeter lens and make really intimate, interesting photographs. That's always what I favor. But when I'm in, France, which is coming up, or when I've been in Japan, I don't speak French and I don't speak Japanese. So for me, I don't have the advantage of being able to verbalize what I would like to do. I basically have to use hand gestures and a smile or raise my camera. And as a result of that, I tend to do more candid stuff just because I lack the verbal skills to be able to do that. But when I go to France, coming up, I'm hoping to create more intimate photographs, despite the fact that I'm not fluent in French. There are plenty of opportunities I have to engage with people, and if I see a photograph there, I'm gonna ask if I can make a photograph, whether I'm sitting in going to visit a blue lingerie and getting some bread or something like that, and engaging, and then where we're doing, but actively try to communicate and have a brief relationship with whoever I'm engaged with, and then say, can I make a few photographs just by gesturing? And my initial trips to Tokyo and Japan, I hesitated to do that because I was so insecure about not speaking the language. But I know what kind of photographs I want to make, and even if we don't even communicate using words, and it's just gestures and stuff like that, and I'm able to produce a photograph, I'm going to come away with the memory of that engagement and the fact that I made photographs that are much more interesting and personal for me as a result of doing that.
I remember when I went to Japan, before going, I started studying some Japanese. And my Japanese is very poor. It's a complicated language for us Westerners. But there's one sentence that I learned, which is "Sumimasen, shashi o totte mo ii desu ka?" which means, excuse me, can I take a photo?
I'm going to have to learn that.
That was a little bit of Japanese that I remember. Okay, yeah, like that we share so many ideas and concepts about how we approach this type of photography. That's really great. But for a moment, I would like to come back to the issue of race, if you don't mind.
Oh yeah.
Look at it from the other, flipping the mirror a little bit, right? We talked about how people would feel, people with a different culture, race, or background to be in front of the camera. But considering, I would like to consider being a person of color, like you are, a black person, being behind the camera and photographing somebody, if it makes any difference.
Yeah.
Were you ever in a situation like where you would feel that people were reacting to you as a black photographer differently than they would reacted to a white photographer or a photographer from their same ethnicity, like in Japan, for example?
I can't really point to anything like that and say that I had a situation where I felt like it was that, at least in terms of the subject themselves, that there was an issue. I can't say that people have questioned my right to take a photograph in terms of police, security people questioning me in terms of what I'm doing there and what am I doing, you know. I've been stopped by police even without taking a camera just because they felt I didn't belong in the neighborhood. Years ago, I was walking in Beverly Hills, and I was visiting a friend who lived on one of those streets, and I'm walking back from I was like 17 or something, and I was just walking there and going to the bus stop so I could get home. The bus stop was, I think, on Santa Monica Boulevard, and I think my friend's house was on Rodeo Drive, and I just crossed the street, and all of a sudden I was swarmed by 4 or 5 police cars. They stopped me, they searched my bag, and I hadn't been doing anything except walking in a neighborhood that someone didn't think I belonged on. So, that's part of the reality that as a person of color that I live with, and have experienced, not to the degree that some people like, George Floyd, who lost his life, and other people, like that poor guy who got shot while he was jogging down in the South somewhere. But it's something that I'm conscious of, that in certain places, if I choose to go out and photograph, and that it may or may not be an issue. It usually doesn't happen, but it's always a consideration for me, in terms of where I'm going, in terms of how that. But one thing I will say about it in terms of Black people when they are being photographed, I think there are some Blacks who are very sensitive to being photographed, because there's sort of a suspicion about, why are you photographing me? What are the images for? It's this idea of that. How do I'm trying to phrase this in a real clear, concise way. I may fail miserably, but there's this sort of idea of
let's put it.
You didn't ask my permission to make my photograph, and I think that it's this sort of idea that entitlement that we talked about is something that many Blacks feel that is imposed on them by others, and that they're somehow being robbed of just some basic modicum of respect and dignity when someone makes their photograph without their permission. And it's not just about how the pictures are going to be used. And it's like, man, you should ask if you want to make my photograph. You should give me the courtesy of asking to make a picture of me, just as a show of respect, because sometimes we, in general, feel that sometimes we are not afforded the dignity and respect of a white person, who's walking down the street, or, walking in a store. And I think some people are very sensitive about that and get very angry about it. Not to the point that I feel like it's been an issue for me a couple of times, and I just kind of explain what I'm doing, and we kind of have a discussion about it. But I think that when I'm confronted about it, I kind of explain what I'm doing, especially when I'm photographing other people of color, because for me, I'm coming from a place where I never got to see people like me in films, in television, in magazines, in books, represented in a particular way. So when I make photographs of people of color, I am doing it because of the absence of that when I was growing up, and also because I just think there's a beauty inherent there. And so whether I make a photograph candidly, or whether I'm approaching someone and asking to make the photograph, that's what I'm about. And so I'm not sneaking anything. I'm always very present there with a camera. There, I'm not hiding anything. So if someone has an issue with me making the picture, I can have a discussion and feel like I can justify what I'm doing. Not that I have to, but I can. And if people sort of understand that, and they say, well, I think you still should ask for somebody's permission. Hey, man, I get that. I completely get that. But they understand that I'm not coming from a place of being disrespectful or trying to take anything away from them that they feel like they deserve. So I hope that makes sense.
It does. And from us, from here, especially from Europe, where the race issue, it does exist. It exists in many communities, but is probably not as present, as pervasive as it is in the U.S. We hear stories about people saying that they were just stopped and freezed just because they were black. And it's one thing to read about it from somebody you don't know. It's another thing to hear somebody you know that confirming that they lived that on their own skin, so to speak. And I can imagine what it would mean for me to, for example, to go to Rodeo Drive and try to sneakily take some photos of people. I could probably get away with it if people notice. I know that nowadays people are more sensitive about privacy and security than they were maybe when you were 17. But if I were to do it today, I would probably, even if the police stopped me and started questioning me, I would probably be able to get away easily. And I'm thinking that maybe a black person would not be able to get away so easily. And the consciously or unconsciously, the people who are being photographed, if they are photographed by a white person, they would think of our motives differently than they would think of yours.
Yeah. I've
Sadly.
not photographed in Beverly Hills, but I've always been curious to do that, just to see if I get that reaction. Mm-hmm. And I have to sort of really, I need to make a plan to just go out there and do that, because there's a couple of factors there. One is like, if you're just shooting on the public street, I'm well within my rights to be able to make photographs. And if I linger around there, and the police are called on me because I'm doing quote unquote, I look suspicious. And then there's other part of Rodeo Drive where they have a lot of stores, but I don't know whether that area of street is considered private. Right, because they have certain streets or certain walkways that even though the public walks through, is considered private. Right, and at that point they can tell you that you're not allowed to make photographs here, despite the fact that people are all the time making photographs with their selfie, making their selfies and stuff like that. But if you're lingering around and you look like you're working with a professional camera, they can question you and ask you to leave. But I'm really kind of curious as to what would happen, especially if I went out there with a white photographer, a white woman photographer, and said, okay, we're both going to photograph here. Let's see if we get any pushback. You can work over here and work around here, and we'll see whether, nothing happens or whether something happens to one of us.
Little social experiment.
Little social experiment, I would hope nothing would happen. I think that would be ideal, But the thing is that I have to, as a person that with my skin color, that's a consideration that I make depending on where I decide to go. It's not, I'm just going to go photograph in this area. I go, well, okay, I have to consider, this and that, in terms of whether I'm going to be confronted for doing something as simple as just making photographs. Because everybody has had the experience being stopped by people, like security people, going, what are you doing? Why are you making pictures here? Are you doing this professional blah, 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 blah? I mean, that's sort of part and parcel, but for photographers of color who are shooting candidly on the street, you also have to sort of factor in the fact that someone may take a look at the color of your skin and assume something a little more negative about what you're doing, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what what I would wanted you to comment about, to give your perspective, because as I said, we're biased. We don't think about that. I don't think about that normally. I don't think about that. It's, to me, it's not an issue at all,
Yeah.
right? But it can be an issue for some people, for many people, and it's good to have your perspective on that. Good.
Yeah, and it's not that it's going to stop me from doing what I want to do. If I want to photograph in a certain place and I know that it's publicly accessible and I'm not violating anybody's rights by being able to do that, I'm going to go do it. But I have to sort of factor in, well, if I might, there's a possibility that I could get pushback, and that's just a thought that passes in my head just because of where I live and who I am. I'd rather not have to even think about that. But it's a consideration. Every time I get into my car to drive to work or drive to different parts of Los Angeles, I'm very conscious about being careful about, how I'm driving, coming to a full stop at a stop sign, not, doing the speed limit, making sure my tags are up and current, because it's like small things like that can result in me getting stopped by the police. Not to the point that I'll have a deadly encounter with them, but every encounter with someone in authority, especially in terms of police, for me and for a lot of other people, is a point of anxiety, right? Because it's sometimes it's like it's one thing to sort of know your rights, right, and then figuring out, when you feel like your rights are being violated, how much do you push back, right? Like one of the things that I think about probably a little bit too much is if I'm photographing on a street and a cop comes up to me and says, what are you doing? And I tell them, I'm just making photographs. And then they ask for my ID, if they don't suspect me of a crime, there's no legal reason for me to give my ID, to identify myself to the police at that point. If someone says he look like he's doing something suspicious, I can explain, no, I'm just making photographs. But the moment they ask for my ID, it's kind of like, I have a right to decline to do that because I'm not committing a crime. And if they don't suspect me of committing a crime, and they'll tell me, well, they're just investigating, because I don't want to get into the system, right? Because if my name is in that system and I get stopped again for the same reason, they're going to see that I've been stopped before for suspicious activity, even though I didn't do anything wrong, right? And it's like, I don't need that. I don't want that, right? But the thing is, how some police officers, most of them will find, they understand that I'm well within my rights to not have to identify myself if I'm not doing anything illegal. And there are other ones who may question me questioning their authority. We see it happen we don't see it happen often enough, but I grew up in South LA. I know that the cops take liberties with people that they feel they have a right to take liberties with, right? Because especially if you live in a certain community, who are you going to believe? The cop or the guy who's pushing back? And even if you don't have a record, because I don't have a record, I've never been arrested, I've never been in jail, but sometimes that doesn't matter, right? And God forbid, I ever have to get to the point where I have to push back and all this other stuff. I don't really want to go through the hassle, but I also don't want to get into the system. And then, when that situation, if it ever presents itself, which I hope it never does, I have to wonder about, well, how much do I have to push back? And some people will go, just cooperate, just do what they tell you. But it's like, I feel like, why should I have to surrender a right that everyone else gets to enjoy for the sake of just being able to go about my business, right? And part of me just bristles at that idea because I know I would even if I walked away from it and everything was sort of cleared up, it would bug the hell out of me that in some way I've kind of didn't stand up for myself and let myself down. And so for me, it's a really complicated thing. You know, I hope I never have to face that, but that's, you know, when I read about different stuff that's happening and I watch too many YouTubes about, you know, police encounters and stuff like that in terms of understanding rights, especially because I'm trying to educate myself even more in terms of rights, not just about being a person of color, but also just being a photographer, trying to understand, you know, especially in California, you know, what rights we have as photographers and when security guards or police have a right to tell us not to do it. But then, you know, whenever I'm going to travel, whether it's in another country or another state or another city, I'm definitely going to understand what the rules are. So that if I ever get some pushback, I can be informed in terms of, you know, my response to whatever someone is telling me or asking me.
Yeah. Again, it's one thing to read about those things. It's another thing to hear somebody, you know, personally confirm them. Maybe one of the reasons we don't see many black street photographers might have to. I mean, before a black person would think of picking up a camera and going photograph on the street, they've all those things to think about, at least in the U.S., that we don't.
Well,
right?
yeah, but I'll push back on that idea because there are a lot of black street photographers, both women and men, that are out there making amazing photographs. They may not get the attention as some of the other photographers that are out there, but oh yeah, there are bunches. And I'm really glad that in talk about like Clubhouse recently and Instagram and different groups, I've been turned on to an amazing group of really talented street photographers, and many of whom who are like sort of focusing on the black communities in which they live. So you get to see, because one of the things about street photography in general is that people sort of gravitate to certain locations, right? You know, it's like Midtown in New York City or Champs-Élysées in Paris or whatever it is. And then regardless of the race of the photographer, they sort of gravitate to certain places in order to sort of photograph. And one of the things that I've loved about seeing photographers who are like, Latinx or Asian or African American and Black, that they're doing street photography in places that are not that are not as frequented, and they're creating really interesting bodies of work in those communities. And part of which, part and parcel to the fact is that they feel like they have access, you know, because someone who's, you know, white is not necessarily going to start roaming the streets of, you know, South LA or Compton or Watts or East LA with the freedom that they're going to feel if they go down to Venice Beach or to downtown Los Angeles, right? Because they're going to have to. It's not necessarily that it's going to be dangerous, because I think that that's too quick of an assumption to make. I think you have to be careful about your safety regardless of where you go with a camera. But I think it's also about that thing we were talking about earlier about the engagement, right? There you have to be very sensitive because you're in somebody else's community where the presence of a camera is not as common, right? So your presence over the camera is going to be questioned. So you have to be ready to be able to sort of explain and engage with people and clarify what you're doing. And for that, a lot of people choose not to go into those areas. But a lot of photographers are doing it, and hopefully a lot more people will be able to discover their work and see street photography and social documentary photography in areas that they've not seen it before.
That would be great. So I don't want to keep you busy for much longer. I know you have lots of other commitments, but yeah, I would like to thank you again for being so open and candid, as the name of your show, about your feelings. It was really enlightening in some respect to the condition of people of color, black people in the U.S., whether they're photographers or not. So
no, thank you.
Thank you again.
I've never
for
had
that.
this conversation on a podcast before, even my own. So I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with you. I think it's a really interesting subject, and I hope that people get a lot out of it.
Yeah, I hope so too. So thanks again for being on the show today. Anything else you would like to say before we close this? Maybe just point people to your website.
People can check out thecandidframe.com, and there they'll find the show, the podcast. They'll also find my photographic work. I have a workshop coming up, online workshop based on using your own life to jumpstart your photography, being able to use some of the most common and mundane experiences of your life and to really transform the way that you see. It's been a popular class that I've taught throughout the pandemic, and it's available through nabechicreative.com. You'll find links for that on my website. And that's it.
Did you say using your life or your wife? Because
your life.
Was
saying your wife can be very limiting.
This can be a very, depending on the situation, can be a very willing subject or not.
Yes, I know that personally.
Great. Okay. Thanks again, and hope we get another chance to talk before a little sooner than a few years.
Absolutely.
That would be great. Thank you, Barionex. Take care. Bye.